We're committed to helping you find the best candidates for your job openings. And I really think today's webinar is going to give you some tools to do just that. For those of you who have attended our past webinars, welcome back. And for those of you who are attending for the first time, we welcome you also. As always, please feel free to connect with us at Charity Village after the webinar. We're always happy to chat and answer any questions that you might have. We do have a few housekeeping items before we get started. In order to have the best audio experience for everyone, we do have all of you on mute, and this minimizes the amount of background noise that we have throughout the webinar. But that means that while you'll be able to hear us speaking, we won't be able to hear you. So we've got a session today that's jam-packed with great information, and we're only going to have a limited time for questions. But if you do have a question throughout the session, please do type it into the question box on the bottom of your GoTo control panel, which is located to the right of your screen. And we're going to do our best to address it in the short question and answer periods throughout the webinar. We're also going to be running some polls through the session, so you'll have an opportunity to vote on your screen, and we encourage you to join in with those. We're very happy to have attendees from all across Canada with us today. And while technology has its advantages in bringing us all together, it can also have a finicky side. If you're experiencing any technical issues during the webinar that are affecting how you see or hear the presentation, do drop us a note via the questions box on your webinar control panel. We may also communicate with attendees in this area if we notice anything on our end that might be affecting your experience. For today's session, we're also live tweeting with the hashtag #CVWebinar on Twitter. So feel free to chime in there as well with your comments and your questions. I'd also like to remind you that we're recording today's webinar, and we will provide this recording to each of you after the event. So there's no need to worry if you get called away during the session. The presentation slides and resources will also be made available to you after the event through an email and also on our website. We'll likely follow up with you via email in the next couple of days so that you'll know where to access these resources. And with that, I'd like to introduce our presenter for today, Gayle Hadfield of HadfieldHR. Thanks for joining us today, Gayle.
Oh, my pleasure, Marina. Thank you very much for that introduction. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Behavioral Interviewing. I'm Gayle Hadfield. I'm a certified human resources professional. Very happy to be here presenting this important information to you. You know, when I was developing this webinar, it was important that I included an introduction and the foundation, so you'll have the principles of behavioral interviewing. Also integrated are best practices for behavioral interviewing, and I've also sharing a lot of my learnings and tips from my recruitment experience. I did an estimate about how many people I thought I'd interviewed, and I think I've hit 1,000. And that would be hiring for vacancies in many sectors, such as the environment and banking, financial services, in IT. But my focus now in my work is primarily on the nonprofit sector and small business. And I love this next, the visual here. What you're looking at, the goal of all recruiters, of course, is how to differentiate and hire the best candidate, given the fact that you might have a large pool of candidates who are interested in your organization and in your role. So here's our objectives and takeaways today. At the end of the webinar, you'll know the core principles and the concepts of behavioral interviewing. Also, you'll know the types of behavioral questions and when to use them in order to get specific information that you really need from each candidate. We'll also look at avoiding discriminatory questioning. So you'll gain knowledge, skills, and tools that you'll be able to walk away and start applying these practices to conduct really good interviews, and of course to confidently know that you're hiring top talent. So I think that's a pretty good takeaway from our time today. And the other thing you're going to receive is I'm including 2 or 3 resource documents after the webinar. Marina will send them to you. Just again to, it touches on all the learnings today and will assist you in using that in your next interview. So here's the 4 modules that we'll cover today. The first one, of course, is the principles and the concepts of behavioral interviewing. And then we'll look at vacancy preparation. What are the best practice steps that you would take when you have a vacancy? Then our primary focus today is going to be on the next 2 sessions, which will be on developing questions and then conducting the interview itself and assessing candidates. So right now what I'd like to do is source from you your input. If you could all please select the statement that best describes your top challenge when you're interviewing. Is it A, you're getting similar responses from candidates and it's hard to differentiate them? B, are you comfortable relying on interviews to make selection decisions? C, you don't want to make a candidate feel uncomfortable, so you may avoid asking some questions. Or is it D, you've hired individuals who did not meet objectives and this has disrupted the team? So make your selection.
That's great. So I see we have some fast and furious voting happening here. We'll just give everyone a few seconds longer and just go ahead and choose the option that best represents you in the screen there. And it's looking, wow, Gayle, we've got quite a split. Looks like 40% for answer A, 20% for answer B, and 30% for answer D.
Okay, so yeah, there's different issues that certainly affect different people, and during our webinar today, we're going to touch on those. You'll walk away knowing how to differentiate candidates and looking at the full selection decisions and how to look at other avenues to pull in on your selection decisions. And number D is very problematic, and that's why these skills are going to help you to avoid that situation. So this kind of touches on D that was just voted on. Here's what poor selection can lead to. Lower productivity. The person isn't able to fulfill the role. And morale can go down. Other team members who are already doing a good job, they're taking time away to help integrate a new individual. And if that's not working out, that can be very frustrating to people who are your good performers. And so overall success can go down of maybe you're not meeting your team's objectives for a while. And also turnover. You're likely, if it was a poor selection, you need to go through the process of exiting that individual and starting the process again. So it can be very timely. I've also included, I don't know if you've ever heard this, if he has a pulse, hire him. And often that happens. It's very realistic. A manager has a vacancy on the team, needs someone right away, and maybe making a quick decision without doing their proper due diligence through a recruiting process. Or you have some candidates, you haven't found the right one, and you go with the person who is the best of the candidates you met with, but they weren't the candidate, they didn't meet the full criteria of what you really needed. So those are problems that behavioral interviewing can manage and avoid these situations. So as a recruiter or anyone involved in the recruiting process, here's your objectives. You want to be able to consistently hire the best candidate available. You want to have the right people in the right job. If any of you've read the book, Good to Great, the premise in that book is that in order to have the best organization, you need to have the right people with the right skills in the right job. And you also want to align your candidate values with your organization's culture and values. So more than just looking at someone's qualifications, your degree of success will be that you've hired when you consider the overall fit of the candidate. And again, your objective is just to avoid those costly and challenging mishires. So here's the elements that make up a role. Every candidate needs to have some element of technical qualifications. That would be there's knowledge that they have, something they're skilled at, their abilities, and typically those are gained through a combination of education and experience. So technical abilities are typically examined through knowledge tests, assessments that you might provide to them, and confirming their skills through references. So you can gather some from an interview process, but you're going to look a bit broader when you want to assess technical. Now here's our focus today is more on the behavioral. So given that someone has the skills to do the job, it's how they perform the work that is going to be important. It's what are the attitudes that they have? What are their abilities and how they apply it and their values to perform the work? You might have maybe you're looking for a project manager and they come well regarded, they've led projects on time and within budget. However, when you look at the behavioral elements of their style, they may have frustrated other people on the project. Perhaps in the past, they focus more on results and not on teamwork or respectful communication. So if you look overall, while they have the technical, because they're lacking in the behavioral, they wouldn't be the best fit to your organization. And that's what behavioral interviewing touches on. So here's the first STAR slide. This is the principle of behavioral interviewing, is that past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. So sometimes I've had managers come and say, you know, Gayle, this isn't the person that I thought we hired. What has happened? And it could be that through questioning, typically it's perhaps they haven't asked the right questions to get a clear picture of the person's past performance and their past behavior to understand what they truly were going to bring to this organization. So the interview's objective, you want to assess and predict their future performance based on their past performance. So you're going to look at how they applied their knowledge, their skills, their abilities through all of their experiences. So this really is the proven the core principle for behavioral interviewing. And there's another piece as well about, well, why behavioral? Well, they elicit a more honest response from candidates, more realistic view. If you ask a candidate, tell me about, you know, what role and how you've worked with other teams, they're likely going to say, well, I've done a really good job. I am a good team player. But if you ask something behavioral, tell me about your last team. What went well? What didn't go well? Tell me about a conflict you had on the team. All of a sudden, you're starting to get a realistic picture of who they are and what they would bring to your team. So the second bullet here is you want to get insights about their skills, abilities, and interests that are important to the role and your specific company culture. So the bottom line is behavioral interviewing is to best predict future performance, because that's what you'll care about when they walk in and start with you. So that's a summary. It's the key points for behavioral interviewing. What we covered is you're going to be sourcing behavioral information about the candidate's experiences, and you're going to use an overall behavioral selection process to best predict future performance. So let's, Marina, do we have questions now? Let's take time for one question on those principles.
Sure, thanks, Gayle. So here's a question that comes up quite a bit. What if we're not paying top dollar for the role? How can we still ensure that we're hiring the best candidate?
Oh, good question. This comes up, it comes up a bit in the nonprofit sector for sure. One of the objectives is, or your core objective is to hire the best candidate given your salary range. So if you look at the critical parts of the role and what's required, and you hire to that, you want to make sure you've got a broad outsourcing or outreach for candidates through referrals, through LinkedIn, through Charity Village, of course, really make sure that you have made the job, made your organization, the role look very engaging, talk about all the great aspects about what it's like to work there. A lot of people value the mission of an organization and the work environment over just making the most money. The other option that I've seen happen in nonprofits is to look at some options. If you're looking for, a role and you just can't find the person at the right amount, maybe someone would be interested in working 4 days a week. They would still have the full profile, but to the degree that a flexible work schedule might be valuable. Or maybe they get to attend a couple of conferences that are very interesting, but just that's not a given every year. But it could appeal to the right candidate because you're still looking for the best candidate within your salary range.
That's great. Thank you so much, Gayle.
Okay. All right. So the next module we're going to look at is vacancy preparation. You have a vacancy for whatever reason, and I'd like to hear from everyone just what's the first step you or your organization takes when a vacancy is identified. So if you can provide your input, the first one is, do you advertise using a standard job posting that you've used before? Or B, do you discuss the requirements for the role considering your organization's future plans? Or C, do you consider your top performers and their skills and attributes? Or D, do you develop a selection profile that defines the technical and behavioral competency required? So please do share what is typically the first step that you take.
Great, so just go ahead and vote, everyone, on your screen.
Yeah.
Looks like we've got most people have voted now, so we're showing about 40% for option B, and then a split of 25 and 25 between option A and D. So again, a fairly wide split across the board there.
Right. It always reflects what's going on in your organization. So I would think the focus on this is if you're doing B, C, and D, those are the three pieces that would create the foundation for behavioral interviewing. Using a standard job posting, sometimes that happens again because there's a vacancy and the goal is to fill it as soon as possible. So it just seems that's our best path. But when we look at looking for our ideal candidates, we'll do a combination of B, C, and D that we're going to cover in the next few slides. So you have a vacancy identified. Here is the number one first step always to do is to assess the role. So of course all this depends on how large is your organization, what's happening in the organization, but you're going to assess the role. Even if, say you have a team of 5 people, someone leaves, you would look at the role and determine, all right, what's the expertise that we have on the team already? Is our organization going to be making changes in the future? Should we bring someone in that has some of those skills or abilities that would help the whole team? Or do we have a lot of expertise already on the team and maybe we can hire somebody who has less experience or a new grad and we can integrate them into the role? So you're going to really assess and determine your ideal candidate. Maybe the role description says they need 2 years experience. Well, maybe you think in this situation we could bring someone in with 1 year. And so you're always hiring for the future, and always step 1 and 2 is assess the role and determine your ideal candidate. So once you have that, then you can start developing an ad that's very engaging and specifically is going to attract people that have that skill set. Then you're going to do telephone in-person interview questions. You're going to develop exercises to assess those skills that you've identified. And then references regarding behavioral questions will all be pulled from your ideal candidate profile. And then, of course, at the end, you assess the candidate and make the decision. So once you've assessed the role and to get your ideal candidate, here's the aspects that will make up your ideal candidate. And you can see here that there'll be a resource document that shows a selection profile. I've actually used a sample. On the sample is a development coordinator. So this would be an individual who supports fundraising efforts, has contact with donors, would need to have some database experience and perhaps some experience on Razor's Edge. So remember in the first section we talked about the role has two elements, every role, technical and behavioral. So on your selection profile, you'll look at what education does this individual need? What knowledge do they have to have? And how many years experience considering the level of the role? And then what do they need to be skilled at? Then part two of your ideal candidate has those behavioral aspects. What is it about? They have to be motivated and have initiative. These would be two behavioral indicators for any role nowadays. Changeability and adaptability is important in any role. You know, change is no longer going to happen occasionally. It's built into the DNA of organizations now that there's always this continual flow of change. You want someone to have a level of openness to others, empathy, personableness. This person will be talking to donors. They'll be dealing with team members. And also self-management. This person needs to have an ability to manage priorities, to manage their stress levels, and to be self-aware of areas of emotional intelligence. And also, you're going to want to pull out, you're going to pick, what is it about our culture and values? What's important to us? If it's a nonprofit, it would be, what's the purpose of your mission? And we're going to want to articulate that in what we look for in a candidate. So you've got your technical behavioral spelled out, so you have come up with your ideal candidate so that you'll know who you're looking for, and then through your great behavioral interviewing, you'll know when you have found them. So here's a condensed version of a selection profile that I develop for every role that I'm hiring for, whether it's the cook or the CEO. There's always a selection profile. Here's just a brief one. Under education experience, we think this person needs a diploma, 2 years experience. We want them to have already completed 2 fundraising courses. Technically, we want them to be proficient on databases, MS Office, spreadsheets, Razor's Edge is an asset. And with abilities, you've indicated, we've put down what are some important things for them to be able to do. Now, under column C, you would determine which of these are really critical that the individual has to have coming into the role. And where there's the little dash, that would be it's preferred, but we're willing to train someone, or we think we can find someone with this other experience and interest. They don't have to have those coming in. So it says Razor's Edge is an asset. It's good, but not essential. And then at the top, we'll talk about that at the end of the webinar. That would just be you're assessing the candidates, and we'll have a rating guide that says between 1 and 10, you know, have they completed the courses? How proficient are they on databases? So number 1, 2, 3 really represents each candidate that you're going to meet with. So remember, I spoke initially about behavioral interviewing. Well, beyond just the interview, there's a lot of behavioral touch points with a candidate. One would be you get to see their behaviors through the questions that they pose when you initially talk to them, or through your telephone screening, how they are on the phone, how they respond to your questions. Then the in-person interviewing is when you really have a chance to spend more time with them, dig a bit deeper. Maybe you have them back to come and meet the team before you make a final selection. In all of these, you're seeing their current behaviors, and also through the behavioral questions, getting the source of their past. So in all of these touch points, provide you with behavioral indicators. I heard someone was giving tips on, I think it was an email the other day, on for candidates on how to make the best impression at an interview. And one was be nice to the receptionist, because again, every behavioral or contact with the candidate is going to be important. So here's a summary of this module. Is just define your ideal candidate and then develop a selection profile. And that selection profile is going to be your guide to developing questions and assessing candidates. So lots of information. Marina, do you have any questions for vacancy preparation?
Yes, absolutely. One that keeps coming up. We've got probably a large number of smaller nonprofits on the call today. So a question that's coming up is, what if we don't have a designated HR person to work on the selection profile? Who in the organization might be responsible for pulling this together, and how could they do that?
Oh, okay, great question. Yeah, typically it would be the hiring manager. So maybe there's someone supporting the hiring manager, but it would be the hiring manager's role to really define the ideal candidate that they need. So they would define the technical skills and the behavioral. Also, as an organization, if you're a smaller organization, you could have that pre-done, do it as a group. What are the technical skills we need for each of our few roles? And then what is our value, cultures, and behaviors? Because those will be applicable to most roles that you're going to hire for, and you would have the whole team or organization on board so that you're not starting from scratch, and you have a great starting point. That would be a great idea, to include more people. But ultimately, it's the hiring manager that would apply that.
That's great. Thanks, Gayle.
Right. So now we're going to move on to the important piece of the questions. And I'd love to get your input. If everyone could please select the process that your organization uses for developing questions. It's either A, do you have a standard set that you use for all vacancies, then add some unique ones based on the role, or do you have a more informal process and don't typically enter into interviews with a formal set, or have you not been involved in that developing questions before?
Great. So once again, everyone, I just encourage you to go ahead and make your selection on your screen. And Gayle, it's looking pretty overwhelming. 80% have a standard set and add more based on the vacancy.
Okay, that's a great starting place. Congratulations. So as we go through the questions, the next section, let's look at what questions are going to be some of the best questions and why you would use different questions at different times. So what are your question principles in behavioral interviewing? It's to elicit behavioral information about past experiences and accomplishments. You want to understand more than just their previous actions. You can know what they did on the resume, but you're curious to know how they work, how they apply their skills, what their views are. So really, to understand what they're bringing to the here and now, you're going to come out with in your mind, think about curiosity. Tell me more. So here's how a behavioral question is structured. It's called the STAR technique, and it's, if you buy textbooks or university books on behavioral interviewing, this is the core process that's used to develop questions. What was the situation they were involved in? What task were they assigned? What action did they take? And what results did they get? So it could be, I see you were a member of a part of that writing team. What tasks were yours? Because often if you ask someone a question, they might say, well, we did this or we produced this. You want to know, well, okay, what tasks were you assigned? What was the action that you specifically took? And what was the result of your actions in that case? Were they deemed successful? What challenges did you have? So the STAR technique is how each question would be developed. So here's the types of questions that you're going to be working with. First one, of course, is just an open question, and we're going to go through these in detail. A closed question, a leading question, situational question, or a probing question. Now, probing gets more highlight because it's through the probing questions that you begin to really differentiate candidates so you know who you're going to be bringing on because you'd have a clear picture of who they are. So open questions. You probably, if you're going out with standard questions, you're asking these. You want to get the candidate talking to cover a topic. Usually you might say, you know, what was your role in that project? You know, why did you respond that way? How, or please explain. So why are you looking to leave your current position? They would tell you something and then you do probing questions. Tell me about the responsibilities of your current job. Based on what they tell you, you do a probing question. So they might say, well, my responsibilities are talking to donors, working on Razor's Edge, and doing admin for the team. Then you start probing. What was the percentage of time that you actually were dealing with donors? What were your responsibilities with donors? But these are the general open questions that get them talking. And what process did you go through to decide on your current career path? Then, of course, closed questions. You want a definitive response. Are you able to work the full shift and each day of the schedule? You're looking for yes or no. Are you currently a member of the Association of Professional Fundraisers? Yes or no. Do you have a current driver's license? And see, even on a closed question, you can still probe further on any type of question. Oh, you have a driver's license. Do you have any restrictions? What class do you have? And here's leading questions. And I have the big in bold, avoid. Leads and encourages a candidate to provide the answer you want to hear. So it doesn't allow for the candidate to give their preference. And the candidate really wants a job. They're not always looking for the best fit. You know, I really respect they're looking to have a job. It's the right thing to want. So why do people ask leading questions? My experience over the years has been that sometimes interviewers will ask leading questions to make the candidate feel comfortable. So it could be, you know, we're really team focused. Do you prefer working alone or as part of a team? Well, if you heard that question, most people would say, I'm very team focused. I definitely prefer working as part of a team. So that leading question, you're not getting a behavioral response. You're not getting an accurate picture of who they are. Or you enjoy working with budgets, don't you? You know, I might have a hard time saying yes to that one, even if it was leading, but there it is. Situational, hypothetical. It asks how someone would deal with it. How would you deal with a difficult client? The behavioral version of that is, tell us about a time you dealt with a difficult client this past year. Then you would probe. What did you think provoked them? What did they say? So you can see that by asking the behavioral version, you're getting a picture and you can almost visualize this person working. It starts to put all the pieces of their story together. So situational still have a place. Sometimes they're done as an exercise to assess how they would deal with a situation. Or I've seen them in role plays in an interview, just because sort of after you've gone about their ability to deal with a difficult client, you could also add on a situational after that. But the behavioral is the base. So we're just midway through the questions, but I know there's a lot of content here. Marina, have any questions come in so far on this section?
Absolutely. So with regards to telephone screening, I know that we just briefly touched on how long should a telephone screen be, and how many questions should they be asking there?
Oh, okay. A telephone screen, it depends on the level of the role. When I was telephone screening for the cook position was 10 minutes. When I was interviewing recently for an executive director role, those telephone screening were more 35 to 40 minutes. So the questions on a telephone screen, there won't be many. Typically, you're looking for motivation and interest, so 2 or 3 questions. What caught your eye about this particular job that prompted you to apply? Why are you looking to leave your current position? What do you know about us? So a bit about the motivation is really important. Then you're going to ask them a couple of questions on their skills, maybe a couple on behavioral. Tell us about the current team you're on. Tell us about the best team you ever worked on. Then why was that? And then we just wanted to cover off, this is a split shift. Are you able to work this shift, these hours? And if you were selected, when could you start? So you can see in a cook position, that doesn't take that long. In an executive director position, you want to get more, to ask more in-depth questions. Still the same format: motivation, interest, skills, abilities, and closing.
Excellent. And one more question for you, Gayle. What happens if a candidate doesn't actually answer the question, or perhaps doesn't understand the question and answers, with a little bit of different information than what you were really looking for?
Okay, yeah, the candidate, typically if it's an in-person interview, they might be a bit nervous. They don't know what questions are going to come at them. If they get off track, you could interject and maybe sound, that sounds really challenging. Maybe think back to a current role that you had where you did this specific situation. Try to help them get back to where you want the information from. Don't leave them on their own to keep going, because they're answering what they thought they heard. And what was the other part of that, Marina?
Oh, just if the client, or if the candidate, sorry, doesn't quite understand the question, maybe.
Right.
How
Yeah.
can you sort of probe further and get a little bit more from them in terms of the direction you were looking for?
Right. You're always trying to guide them. You're not helping them with the answer. So it's, again, help to guide them and say, well, what we're looking for in this is just looking for a situation where this might have happened. Maybe the donor was upset, was something that frustrated about something. How did you specifically walk us through that conversation that you had with them? So really just you're guiding, you're helping to steer the candidate to get the information that you need. Because again, I've had people come to interviews and they're actually write the question down. And I understand, it doesn't happen very often, but it has happened. So our role as interviewers is to make them comfortable so that they can showcase their strengths. So just a bit of guiding would be good.
That's great.
And they're going
Thank you.
yeah. All right, so let's go a little bit more on questions. Remember, probing questions is our real focus. So it can follow any question type, as we've seen. So it sources more information for a clearer picture of the past. So it could include kind of clarifying or rephrasing, but this is where the uniqueness of the candidate will come through. So, here's a sort of a reflecting, of the responsibilities you just mentioned, which did you enjoy the most? The answer. Then, which did you enjoy the least? Why was that? And you start continuing with probing questions until you feel you've got a clear picture. Here's another one. You mentioned you were a part of a team that wrote the newsletter. What were your specific responsibilities as a writer? And then, what were some of the article ideas you elected for publication? Are you able to provide us with copies of those? And then what strengths did you bring to the team as well? Were you primarily a writer? Did you do other work? And so these probing questions really can source out, rather than just, yes, I was part of a team and we wrote a newsletter. You'll get to see more about what they did. Discriminatory questions. These are questions that we can't ask. And there's a resource document tag on the slide here. The resource document that you're going to receive has some potential information you need and how you would ask a question to source information, but not ask a discriminatory question. So you can't ask questions about their race. There's a few: color, religion, age, and a few others. So you can't see if you have childcare responsibilities. How old are you? When were you born? Because that's not, that won't translate into how they can perform their job. So here's a way to ask one question. This role requires traveling twice a month. Often it's unplanned. You can't say to them, do you have any children? What you could say is, the role requires 1 or 2 trips, often with this much notice. Are you able to fulfill the requirement? And so it's the please don't ring the doorbell. Is you can't ask the question that's discriminatory. Whether or not they have children, it would be up to them to know when or when they couldn't make arrangements to fulfill the job. So you can just ask them, can you fill this bona fide job requirement? Multiple questions. Here's another one to avoid, just because it's confusing to the candidate and it won't allow you to elicit specific information. For them, it's difficult to sort out what someone's just asked them. So, can you tell me about how you dealt with an angry customer? What was the situation? What did you do? What was the outcome? If you happen to be interviewing with someone and they ask a stream of questions, just interject and say, yeah, there's a few questions, there is some information we want. So let's start with, tell us about when you had to deal with an angry customer, and let them answer that, and then start doing the probing questions. But all at once is kind of hard to remember. So you've started to develop questions that relate to each criteria for your ideal candidate. And then this is just a slide from what I typically do. The ordering of questions for an in-person interview, you want to make them feel comfortable, setting the stage. The one in red here is something that I do, and I have found it to be very beneficial. Before I start getting into my questions, I'll say to any candidate, so before we get into we have a formal set of questions that we're going to be asking you, please spend 5 or 6 minutes, and I'd like to walk through your career history, starting with your education. So tell me about how you came to pick this path and selected to get a degree in business management. What was your interest at that time? And by going through the different work experiences, if they've got 20 years of work experiences, I might say, well, let's just go back the past 3 positions that you had. What did you like most about that? Why did you leave that job? What were you hoping to get in the next job? Just so I have a bit of a snapshot of their overall, how they pick their career and how they've moved through their jobs. It's behavioral as well. I want to know a bit more about their interests. And then you move into questions. Sometimes it's technical skills. The candidate's coming to an interview wanting to shine, wanting to showcase their strengths. So you start off with those. And then third bullet down, that's where you start getting into, conflict. Tell us about a time you had a conflict with a coworker or a client. What happened? Typically, you wouldn't open up with that because you want them to feel comfortable showcasing who they are and then move through those that require a bit more thought. And then, of course, their aspirations, your final questions, and then closing. So here's some of my very key questions on motivation. I've just popped it in here. You can refer back to this. But what is it about our role that caught your eye and prompted you to apply? How would you describe the services our organization provides? These are typically in a telephone screen. I'm just curious to know, Are they applying for a lot of jobs? If they are, that's fine. But if they don't know anything about our organization, depending on the level of role, that's going to be a bit of a flag to me. I'm not going to dismiss them necessarily, but if we do go forward to meet with them, I would want them coming in to know a lot about our organization. So there's the different types of questions. Now, developing structured sets of behavioral questions, you would develop a set to address all of the criteria in your selection profile. You'd have some for telephone screening, just a few, your in-person interviewing where you go more in depth. And then on your reference checks, if it's a job, I'm right now helping an organization hire a development officer, the reference checks questions are around their work with donors. They're taking initiative. So I'm asking those questions that we covered in the interview. I'm covering off just to confirm some of their work through reference checks. So, long one on questions, very important. Marina, do we have a question or two for that?
Sure, just a quick one, Gayle. How many questions should there be in a 1-hour interview?
Yeah, I would say probably if you had 20 questions, would maybe around the maximum. Because that only allows about 3 minutes per question. A couple might be closed questions. If you could narrow it down closer to 16, that would be even better.
Wonderful, thank you.
All right, so now you've got the concepts of behavioral interviewing, you've got your selection profile of your ideal candidate, you've got questions developed, and now you're moving in to have the in-person interview with the client, with the candidate. So this slide shows that structural behavioral questions with 2 or more interviews is the most reliable interviewing process. That's a best practice. It allows for listening about more than one person, note-taking, probing, discussion, and coming to consensus. So that type of interviewing process is going to get you the most reliable results. So what's happened in an interview? The interview's objective is to predict future performance. You're trying to assess their knowledge, you're making the best representation of your organization, and you're providing the candidate the opportunity to showcase what they're bringing. The candidate has very different objectives. They want to provide, well, this one actually aligns, and they provide a positive impression of their skills and abilities. They want to find out more about the job, the responsibilities, the duties in a typical day, a typical week, and secure the job. So, but really there's a bit of a different interest. So it's finding the best person who matches, but the candidate really wants an opportunity to feel good when they leave the interview. So here's the process, you know, maintaining professionalism at all times. Even if you felt a bit challenged by a candidate, you're providing them with a very professional response. You're open to hearing their full story. You're not making quick judgments. The candidate should be talking 80% of the time, and the interviewer really about 20%. You're guiding them, they're providing the content. And you're obtaining sufficient information to assess the candidate against your ideal candidate that you've defined. So you would provide the overview and the expectation about what's important near the end of the interview, so that in a way, if you provide it too early on about all the details, they're going to try to align their responses to what you've just said. So these are just some interview process details. You know, this is a very friendly person. He looks like he'd be really welcome a candidate. Thanking people for their interest. Setting the stage, even if it takes a few minutes, it's going to be worthwhile because they can see what you're like, what your team's like, how relaxed you are, they're getting a sense of the culture of your organization. So you tell them a bit about the interview process. We have a structured set of questions, and I say sometimes we're quite informal. We're going to take turns asking questions. Different people might interject if we'd like a bit more information. And, you know, do you have any questions before we proceed? So the more they're relaxed, the more they're going to be able to think back. You begin asking your questions. So again, you're directing the candidate in the process. The candidate's telling you the story. You're using the STAR technique for each question. And it's the probing questions that you ask that will differentiate the candidates. So here's an example. Tell us about a conflict you had with a colleague or manager. So you're going to listen to what they say, and then probing. How did that conflict arise in the first place? What was their stance and what were your views and theirs? So how did it resolve? And if they say maybe, well, it resolved really well. Well, can you tell us exactly what was it something you had said, or what process did you use? Again, they're walking you through a previous movie. So looking back, do you wish you'd handled it differently? And what did you learn from the situation? So you're allowing the candidate to look good. You're just opening the doors to answering this, because this is going to be important to you in your profile for your ideal candidate if they can't deal with managed conflict. So here's some interviewer challenges, and I've come across these before. Candidates very often now are coming much more skilled in being interviewed. So one of them around an interview strategy for candidates is ask the interviewer for questions about how they see their organization doing things. But really, that's not your goal as the interviewer. You're doing a behavioral interview. So if a candidate keeps asking for clarification about the role in your organization, you could ask them, you know, which organization did you feel you did the best work at? They're talking, and then they say, what environment do you provide for employees so they can do their best work? What you'd want to do is say, I'm happy to answer those questions, and we'll have time after we've gone through the ones that I need to ask. You want to keep them on track. So sometimes you get off track in their answer, you pull them back. If they're providing too much information, I've said to candidates before, yeah, thank you for that. I just had a quick look at the time and realized that we want to make sure that we're able to cover all of our questions, so you have a chance to provide input for all of these. So maybe as we go along, would you mind, I'll just let you know when we think we have too much information, or if you could just provide us with a bit of a shorter overview and see how that goes. But you're just wanting to guide them. They might, if they're not providing enough input, you can say, well, I'd like to explore this a bit more. Tell us a bit more about, you know, how you currently prioritize your work. So you come in the morning. What are the first steps that you do to organize? So just keep probing. Some people may be a great performer, but they're not used to providing a lot of information. They might be a bit introverted. So you're doing your best to know that you provided the opportunity where they could really shine. And they seem introverted or uncomfortable. Just do what you can to make them feel well. Set a question up. If it's a question on conflict, you could say to someone, you know, we all have conflicts, come across conflicts at work, in our personal lives. So we'd like to explore that a bit. Just tell us about a conflict or a disagreement you had. So help them feel comfortable. You don't have to lead them, but you can help set the stage for them. So now we move on. I wanted to touch on exercises and assessments. This is something you might want to do to source their knowledge, experience, and skills. Gives you with real information that can confirm what you believe about them from the interview. When you're interviewing writers, I've done many hirings for writers, and often we have them write something that's related to the role. If it's maybe a press release has to go out, we'll give them 1 hour and say, here's a situation. if you can write a news release for us. And typically that really helps differentiate candidates as well. Common interviewing mistakes, you may have heard these, this person just feels like there's something, I just have a good feeling about this person. That's why you have an ideal candidate profile in order to do that, to make sure you don't just rely on your gut. Ranking candidates, saying, well, this candidate I liked more than this one, but really did that top candidate really fit your ideal candidate? So there's just a few more you can go. The getting stuck on a perceived negative answer. If someone gives you an answer you think was negative, maybe ask them another question that may give them an opportunity to be more positive about it. Failure to evaluate. So these are a couple more that are common mistakes. So we're back to our selection assessment now. This was your ideal candidate. You're going to use an assessment rating of 1 to 10 on each candidate. And the beauty of this is if remember you've got 2 or 3 people interviewing, if you've rated someone on the ability to build and maintain trusting relationships as high, they've rated them as lower, it's an opportunity to have a discussion. What was it you saw about them? What was it I saw? What do we really think? How important is this to the role? That's another reason why you have this selection assessment. So there's a group understanding when you hire the person. The person that has the highest score doesn't necessarily get the job. It allows you to assess each person. If we selected each person, what is it when they come in? What are they strong at? Where are areas that we may have to keep developing them? So you have a clear picture of who you've hired. Reference checks. This one you can read later, just talks about probing areas you want more information on, either to clarify, confirm, give you their perspective. It's really helpful. The reference checks are critical that you talk to their previous managers. So a bit more on references, confirming the roles, have your questions, and talk about any area that you want input on. References of their direct managers it's a perspective that you'll need to have. So there's our last module. You've used a structured formal interview process, created the right environment for the candidate, you've asked your questions, you've got great skills, and now you can confidently hire top talent. Any questions? I know we're just about at time, but time for a question, Marina?
Yes, definitely. We have a couple that we'd like to get to before we close out today. This one's popped up from quite a few people. What is your opinion, Gayle, on actually handing out the questions to the candidate before the interview?
Typically, I've done that for a second interview, but I haven't done it for a first interview process. Because what you're looking for when you're interviewing someone is a really realistic view of, not to think about the story, but to just pull a true snapshot at that moment in time. I think, there's nothing against doing that as long as you provided everyone with the questions ahead of time. But typically, I don't do that, and I only do it if the team agrees it would be useful at the second interview stage.
Excellent.
So it's a practice I've seen, and you're still going to get the behavioral from them, but maybe you want to see it would definitely make them more comfortable. I could see that, and that's why we've done it at second interviews.
Okay, great. I think that's wonderful. Another question that's come up from quite a few people, we've had questions about unionized environments. So are there requirements for asking exactly the same questions and probing in exactly the same way with each candidate in a union environment?
If that's for an external hire, it's not as important. I mean, for anyone who is in the union and doing internal interviewing, you definitely have to ask the same question of each candidate. Whether or not, even if it's a non-union environment, there's a tendency, if you ask someone a question and won't completely, feel that they provided the answer that you were looking for, the behaviors, if you don't ask another candidate that, you're just going to assume that it would have been fine. So in order to have a complete, so that they're valid and you can rely on the outcome, in a union environment, I believe it is essential that you ask each candidate the very same questions.
Wonderful.
I've worked in a unionized environment, and we needed to do that also to support in case you get a grievance, to be able to say you've asked the very same questions.
Great. And just one more quick question before we wrap up. Now, if you're interviewing a new grad or someone who doesn't have a lot of work experience, how can you assess how they'll be performing in the future? Some of our participants have said it seems like maybe there'd be a bit of guesswork required there.
Yeah, you never hire based on guesswork. So in our behavioral, what you'll look at is in universities now and colleges, a lot of the program itself involves teamwork, working on teams, and also professors know, did they get working on time? Were they engaging in the class? Were they participating? Teamwork is an important one. So you can gather that by asking them questions about their work on those teams. Maybe they volunteered. Even if they've had it doesn't matter where they've worked, even if it isn't in their field, it's their behaviors on the job that it would be important to talk to their manager. So you can definitely find out there are other ways that are as credible in the absence of related work experience.
Great. And what if the candidate, while we're talking about references here, what if the candidate worked at a place that doesn't provide references as a policy? We're running into that more and more often now.
Yeah, that's definitely coming up. Sometimes the manager, maybe it's a manager who has left the organization, maybe they can get something in writing. Typically, some of those organizations, if you could ask the organization, if I authorize you to release the information to this potential employer, would you be able to release the information? Because it definitely, you don't want to hold someone back. If I'm interviewing a candidate and they said their organization won't, I ask them to please speak directly to someone at the organization or their manager to say that it's going to be essential. If they can't get that, you're going to have to try at either talking to their profs, or you just wouldn't be able to get it, but you're always going to try everything you can to get that information. I definitely see that happening more, though. Quite often
great.
people can, though,
That
through
sounds
their
like
yeah.
That sounds like a tricky situation.
It can be, but typically they can try asking if they authorize, or maybe they can try with a different manager to provide the information.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Gayle, so much for such an informative session today. It's been really great.
You're welcome. Thank you, everyone. Here's your additional resources. Marina is going to provide me with some of the top theme questions that weren't answered today, and she will provide my input to you. And if you do have any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you very much.
That's great, and thank you, Gayle, and thank you to all of you as well for joining us today. It's been great to have you with us. And before you sign off, I just want to remind you that we'll be sending out all of that information that Gayle just went over, along with a survey about today's webinar. So you should get that probably in the next couple of days, if not tomorrow. I'd also like to just quickly remind you about our new Unsung Heroes video series that is going to be profiling real Canadians from the nonprofit and charitable sector who are creating positive change in communities across Canada. We're currently accepting nominations, and in the follow-up email that you get, we will include a link to that so you can easily submit yours. Every nominator will be entered into a draw to win a $500 donation to a charity of their choice. So we do encourage you to get those nominations in. And of course, if there's anything that Charity Village can do to assist you with your recruitment needs in the future, please do get in touch. And I hope you all have a fantastic day, and goodbye for now.